I'm Mark Buckshon of Ontario Construction News, and you're listening to the Tools of the Trade monthly Toolbox Talk.
Welcome, please welcome
to another episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast, your number one construction industry resource. Hear conversations with industry professionals to get the tools, stories, and advice that you need to set your career on fire. You're now streaming the Tools of the Trade podcast.
The Tools of the Trade monthly Toolbox Talks are proudly presented by the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum. The Canadian Apprenticeship Forum has something called the Apprentices in Canada e-panel. And this e-panel is an initiative the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum undertakes on behalf of its members. The e-panel collects insights, ideas, and feedback of apprentices using online surveys, helping to identify new ways to overcome training and workplace challenges. This community of more than 3,500 participants provides information on experiences from inside the Canadian apprenticeship system. They reach out regularly to the pre-apprentices, apprentices, and early career journey persons who are members of the e-panel for their feedback so they can better understand the issues that stand to impact recruitment, retention, and training outcomes. Regular reports and semi-annual snapshots allow stakeholders to identify challenges and opportunities and get a sense of big picture trends in the apprenticeship and trades training. Apprentice insights are regularly shared through one-pagers and survey reports on specific topics. Please, guys, encourage apprentices in your network to share their experiences by sending them to www.apprenticesInCanada.com. And for more information on the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, head over to CAF-FCA.org. Again, send your apprentices to www.apprenticesInCanada.com. And for more information about the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, again, head to CAF-FCA.org. What's up, guys? Thank you for tuning into another episode of the Tools of the Trade monthly Toolbox Talks. I'm your host, Colin, and in this Toolbox Talks segment, I sat down with Mark Buckshon, lead editor and founder of Ontario Construction News. Ontario Construction News is a daily news publication with several different territories in Canada and the US. Mark has a very cool story about his career in journalism, where he spent time in Africa during the Rhodesian Zimbabwe War and how that changed his outlook on life, how his career transitioned from foreign correspondent to construction news editor, legal notice publications, why they're important and what they are, and why he continues to focus so much energy on the construction industry. To read the newspaper, you can visit ontarioconstructionnews.com, and to get in touch with Mark and for show notes, pop over to toolspodcast.com/August. Please join me in welcoming today's guest, Mark Buckshon. Mark, thank you so much for joining me on the Tools of the Trade monthly Toolbox Talk.
Hi, I'm glad to be here, and I hope to be able to answer your questions and participate in this process. It's going to be an interesting experience for me.
Good. Well, we just talked, and this is your first podcast, so I guess in some regards, I'm popping your cherry in terms of other forms of media, and you are a publisher. But how I'd like to start, and how I usually start with the monthly Toolbox Talks, is just getting you to introduce yourself in full. So your company name, where you're located, your industry, and exactly what you guys do.
Okay, well, our company is actually a grouping of companies. We have a U.S. business and a Canadian business, and so we call ourselves a Construction News and Report Group. It's a publishing business. We have websites, e-magazines, and most recently, the Ontario Construction News, which is actually a daily construction trade newspaper. There's a legal reason why those words are used, which I could talk to you about later. And I own all the shares of the business, and I am the publisher, but I'm a journalist at heart. And so my passion is in researching and finding good stories and interviewing people. So it's unusual for me to be on the other side of the microphone here. But I really enjoy the work, and I thrive at the concept of creating and discovering interesting things about the industry.
That's awesome. You know what? When I started the podcast and I started talking to people, and I'm a huge fan of journalism. I like to watch Vice, which is kind of my favorite journalism publication. I love their foreign correspondents and the people that are throwing on army helmets and going in the middle of a war zone and getting the best stories. And when I started interviewing people, I realized, hey, I'm kind of doing a bit of journalism here, and I actually really love it. Like when I'm sitting in front of other people chatting with them. I love trying to pull the stories out and get the conversation going. It's taken me a bit to get comfortable, but it's awesome that I get to do it to another journalist, publisher. You've got so many titles here. So what exactly would you say your title is and your role at Ontario Construction News? Or how would you prefer we call the company, because you have a branch?
Yes, well, it's the Construction News and Report Group, but Ontario Construction News is of course the reason we're talking. So just to clarify, we have titles in a series of a number of U.S. markets, for example, North Carolina, California, New York State and City, and Chicago. And also we have the daily publication, the e-letters and other content such as that. And essentially we're a specialized local or regional trade publisher for the construction industry. So we publish content that would serve those relevant communities and with the depth of interest in content that would be relevant for the people in those markets. My role, well, I'm the publisher, so that means I effectively run the business, and that means oversees the overall operation. But my passion, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, is journalism. So I spend a fair bit of time actually researching, writing stories. We have a staff editor whose full-time job is journalism, but I carry on and do a lot of writing.
So if you're to publish an article and somebody's to see it, what does it actually say beside your name at the bottom?
Ontario Construction News staff writer. I just cop out. If I'm writing an actual piece, which is in my role as publisher, I'll call myself a publisher. But when I'm doing I guess the day-to-day grunt work of journalism, I'm just a working journalist.
Gotcha. Cool. So tell me a little bit about the newspaper and how it got started. And I believe you started out with print, right?
That's correct. The business started more than 30 years ago. That shows my age here, of course. As a young person in university, I worked on the student newspaper at the University of British Columbia, and they had an informal apprenticeship program where the junior students were taught by the senior students who would, if they had the right connections or a little bit of luck or creativity, would get a job at a daily newspaper. And that sort of worked for me. I did have a job at the Vancouver province while I was going to university as a police reporter. But I wasn't that good, frankly, at that stage. I had issues with my writing and quality of work. And I was basically told by the newspaper that they would not take me on full time. And they said, well, I thought, what should I do? I said, maybe you should travel. And I said, well, maybe go to Europe or something like that. I had money, but I didn't want to go to Europe. So I decided a little different route. I decided to overland through Africa. That trip lasted about eight months, came back home, got a job at a small daily newspaper in Alberta, Canada. And there I really mastered the craft. I really learned how to work quickly and fast and write lots of content. And then I decided that I was following the developments in Africa. I had graduated to be the desk editor. That is the person who actually writes the headlines and stuff like that on the small publication. The poor people in the Medicine, Alberta were receiving a whole lot more African news than they probably cared to know. But there was no one supervising my choice of stories, so I put them in. And I decided that I really wanted to see the end of a war. And so I decided that I would go to what was then Rhodesia. And the goal was to see the final months of the war and the transition to Zimbabwe. And I sent a letter off to the news agency that was part of the newspaper chain and basically asked if they could use a little service of a part-time correspondent, which is called in the journalism world stringer. Not a full-time staff foreign correspondent, but you still get your stories published. And they got the answer, yes. And so off I went to Africa on my own dime. And I quickly realized there was a bit of a problem when I got there. Firstly, number one, if I went in as a journalist to this country, the Rhodesians at that time were very wary of Western journalists, so they would basically put you on the next plane out. So the answer there was I went in as a student. Then I went to the local newspaper organization. Of course, their staff was all being drained by call-ups for military service, and said, I can a competent editor or sub-editor can use me. And I offered to work in the secondary city of the country, which is not exactly a hot spot for tourism, called Bulawayo, and got offered a job. And that solved the problem of the fact that this war wasn't going to end in 2 months. It was going to take a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it took 18 months.
Wow.
And basically, I lived through the experience. I filed stories to Canada until I was caught by the authorities, and then focused on trying to make motorcycles run in my daytime and work at my night shift when the evening came. And It was a great experience, though. It was a lesson learned about life and the world, and I guess you call it the coming of age experience, the discovery of who I was underneath all the surfaces. So that's basically, I came back to Canada in 1980 to a recession. There were no jobs. Newspapers were closing right, left, and center. This was a time when interest rates were 25%.
Yes.
There was chaos in the industry, the world. It was the Reaganomics recession. Took a job washing dishes at McDonald's, went to the Federal Employment Agency, which was then called a Canada Employment Center. Now it's Service Canada, I believe.
Yeah.
And someone there actually talked to me and said, would you like a job with the government? And I said, we're offering you a job with the Employment Commission. I said, okay, can you type? Yeah, 70 words a minute. So they offered me a job and they put me in the typing pool. Now, the purpose of this job, the counselor said, is not to be a typist for the rest of my life. It's to enter the federal civil service and get access to closed competitions. That worked. I get promoted to a writer-editor job with the federal government and the employment department in Ottawa. And that's when I moved to Ottawa a year later in 1981 to have 6 years of emotional hell. I mean, you got to recognize a journalistically entrepreneurial type person does not belong in a bureaucratic organization.
No kidding.
This is not the right place.
And you lasted 6 years, you said?
Yes.
Jesus.
Barely. But there was a lot of mental health issues, I must say, going through that time. I resolved it by quitting cold turkey to sell real estate, which was an unusual decision. Most of my peers thought, why are you doing this? And I thought, I just knew I needed to break out. And it worked exactly the way I hoped. Because if you really want to start your own business, you do need to know something about selling stuff, don't you?
Absolutely.
Marketing, business development. And if nothing else, although I'm still a writer at heart and passion, I can certainly recruit and hire a competent sales team and do all that stuff because I understand the process. So that lasted about 2 years. And then I made the next change, was I saw, why don't I start a publication for real estate salespeople and brokers in Ottawa, a newspaper at the time. And that was my first title, Ottawa Real Estate News. And several people had told me at the time, there's not a chance in hell of this working. And I said, okay, I've got to figure a way to finagle money out of the employment insurance system so I can survive for a while and see what happens.
Yeah.
About a year into the business, someone was running a trade show in Ottawa for the construction industry. And I attended this and I thought, my God, this is a much bigger market. And I thought, I've always enjoyed construction. When I was a kid, I would build things in my house. I loved to watch road crews at work. And I thought, why don't I start a local construction newspaper? And that's where the first title of my repertoire was born, Ottawa Construction News, in 1990. Essentially, the business has carried through all the years, evolved, because obviously the world had changed from print to electronic means. I grew it from Ottawa. I set up in Toronto. And then in the late 90s, I did something a little crazy at the time. I started a publication in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
I started essentially the smallest multinational corporation probably known to the world of business. And for a while, it worked. Well, for a little while, we were growing the business in the U.S. and we had titles in 5 different cities, print titles. But it was amazingly mismanaged, all I can say. There was a lot of problems with the sustainability of our client base, the way we related and treated our customers. And I know later in the session, you may have some questions about how we can conduct business better. But whatever, it became a survival exercise, and we shrunk down to barely nothing in 2006-07, began a gradual rebuilding. Various points and times began to stabilize the business with an increased focus on client service. And then as we got to the most recent incarnation, they changed some laws in Ontario, which allowed me to do something I'd always dreamed of when I was young, to start a daily newspaper. And that's when Ontario Construction News was born a year ago.
Wow. That's an amazing story. So there's so many places jump off here. I knew your story going into this about going to Africa, and you mentioned that it gave you some perspective. And I was curious, you're there for such a long time, you're experiencing conflict. It seems to me like the most wild adventure that you could go on, being involved in a war and documenting it. And it sounds awesome. But I was wondering if you can tell me, like, if your outlook on life changed, or if you had any extreme realizations, like picture yourself going in there and what you knew and then coming out and how things changed for you, and if that's carried through now.
Yes, I did. And although I didn't take any unnecessary or crazy risks except at the very end, I did have an epiphany at the very near the end of this. And it was ironically on Good Friday, 1980. And the war was over. The British were still in interim administration before the government of Robert Mugabe would take over. And I decided to go out to a remote village outside of Bulawayo, about 100 Ks outside of Bulawayo where I lived, which would have been the center of the insurgency in that part of the country. I'd always been very careful, stayed in the cities, never gotten any trouble, but people told me, well, it's okay. And the whites thought it was crazy, but I took a local African bus and I was the only white person on the bus
Hmm.
and was given a seat of honor and ended up in this place called Chilocho. And it turned into a rather wild night. Basically, there were people who were part of the insurgency who weren't happy that one tribe had won the war and another one wasn't represented, and they were ready to start another insurgency. I was ready to spray this very big guy with a can of Raid. Someone suggested that might not be a good idea. That guy and three other guys stole one of my camera. Remember standing up on a police table, table in this room, this bar, and saying, "I expect my camera back that night." So I'm staggering out of the bar at the end of the day. The police van rolls up, and four guys are in shackles and chains. And it was a police camp. There were all kinds of off-duty officers in the place. They knew exactly who to find the guy who stole my camera, and they brought him in. And I finished the night up with the white district police chief, continuing the drinking, which of course is totally irresponsible behavior and did result in me getting fired from my job. But the discovery I discovered was the core of who I was, I guess. I realized that I'm a nerdy guy, but maybe I'm not that afraid. I'm got some moral principles. I got some values, and well, maybe I'm reasonably intelligent. I don't know. I sort of saw who I was, and I said, I probably can manage in life okay. And so it was that moment of recognition. The other thing I think about the overall experience was that this was the human condition lived in the most, I hate to do this cliche, black and white way, but it
Yeah.
was. There was all the elements. There was racism, there was nationalism, there was war and peace, there was wealth, poverty, all the basic chemistry elements that make people live in a variety of different situations, and reflected all around the world. And I was living that day to day. So it was quite an experience.
No kidding. And we're seeing so much civil unrest with the Black Lives Matter movement right now. And it must kind of bring you back in a way to what you had experienced back then, and how things haven't changed in so long. And there's a need for that change now.
Yes, and of course, the point is that all the assumptions you make on one side or another of any of these issues, you can find there's a nuance which goes beneath it. So clearly, I was never racist and didn't tolerate for that sort of stuff. But at the same point, living with my housemates who were racist, I mean, they were right Rhodesians for God's sakes.
Yeah.
I did get a perception of how they saw the world, and of course, I did living in Africa for the length of time. I get the perception of blacks. And I just realized that things are, and one level, wonderfully simple, but also wonderfully complex. And I do not have all the answers, but I certainly have some of the questions, I guess. That's what I learned in that very important point of my life.
I love it. So you're kind of reborn. You figured out who Mark was, and you had the confidence to come back to Canada and take over the world with your construction newspaper.
Well, eventually, yes.
Eventually, yeah.
We're
That's
into the Federal Civil Service. But the newspaper business has been interesting and very rewarding because I can combine the curiosity about what's going on around us with the business and the independence that comes with that. So it's a lot of fun.
great. So what does a day in your shoes look like? Like when Mark wakes up and he's the owner of this construction news publication, what do you do between getting up and going to bed within the confines of a typical workday? Like what is your day structured like?
Well, it's interesting on a couple of levels. Firstly, with this pandemic situation, the business has been structured for several years to work from home. So, essentially, my routine is not changed much at all, despite the developments that have happened in the last few months. But basically, I do a combination of journalism and editing. So, I will look at news releases and stories and topics and do occasional interviews, coupled with the business management aspects, namely checking in with people on the staff to make sure that the sales are going well, And of course, anytime there's a problem, guess who gets it? The buck stops with me. But it's not overly stressful. I can now, I'm 66, 67. When it's safe to travel, of course, I can take long vacations with my wife. The business will run itself. So I work, but I don't have to stress it too much, which is nice.
And that's just been from putting forth the proper structure in place so that it can take care of itself while you're gone.
That's right. Obviously, I add some additional resources to cover with the stuff that I would do that we can't do with, I'm taking on some loads, but basically, yeah. And of course, the world now is I can be halfway around the world and still communicate. So there's
Yeah,
no issues with.
you're right about that. So I was thinking of where to go next, and I think I'm going to go here just because we're on the topic of creating content and finding that story. And in construction, I guess in most businesses, but because this is a construction podcast, a lot of us are trying to write articles. We're trying to increase our SEO. We're trying to blog. We're trying to create valuable content for others to consume so that we can drive traffic, whether that's somebody like myself who's in construction that has a podcast, or whether it's a business. And I was wondering if you have any general advice or things that people should focus on doing more of when they're trying to create content to market either like yourself or myself or their own business in general. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, outside of being real and being truthful and telling a story that's interesting, I tend to think about from a business development perspective, which is presumably the purpose people are doing this type of media stuff for.
Most
If you're a
definitely.
business, is I look at the most valuable resource that a business has is its current clients or recent clients. And what are their stories? What is their passion? What are their interests? You're probably using this technique with your podcast, which is perfectly legitimate and appropriate way to do it, because you bringing the people that are your clients into the picture does two things. One, of course, it strokes their egos and makes them more loyal to you. It also gives you leads from your existing business that they didn't know that you could provide assistance with, but it also sets you up for the both soft and hard referrals. The hard referrals, of course, the person says, look, I know you so and so, you could probably call this person, it'd be great. But the soft referrals, of course, is the presence of the publicity and the recognition that these people are doing good enough to do business with you. Therefore, maybe someone else who sees the podcast or sees the broadcast or the website would be interested in doing business with you. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect would be if you have information that's actually useful and practical to assist people, of course, share it. Don't be worried about people stealing your brilliant ideas. Yes, that will happen, but basically the original source will still come back. And that helps people enjoy reading things that are useful, that do good for them, rather than puffy promotional stuff.
Yeah, and I see a good mix of that. There are the people that like to talk about themselves a lot, and that's probably because it's the easiest, most accessible topic to speak about, and it's hard. Like now that we're talking here, I'm thinking about my personal challenges, and the thing that I found challenging in the beginning of starting this podcast was remaining authentic and being myself and not trying to come across as somebody else whose podcast I listen to and taking their style and adopting it. Obviously, there's good and bad points, but do you have any tips for somebody that's creating content on how they can stay authentic and real? Because I find that it's challenging to not take and plagiarize too much other information and to really become real. Because when I started this, I started to get stage fright. I was thinking, I'm going to be talking to complete strangers, releasing this to the general public that's going to have complete access to every conversation I'm having. And I have no clue if they're going to like it. I have no clue if I'm doing a good job. And I'm terrified of being myself and saying some things that maybe I believe in that others don't.
Well, the point is you do have to take some risk here if you're going to pull it off. The thing that I notice with people who perceive their approach to take with what they call media relations or publicity is either they're absolutely afraid to do it, or they fall into what I call the stereotype assumptions of what they think people want to hear. Yes, there are conventions, and following the conventions is very important. Podcast, you obviously have to make sure your technical quality is good, your audio and visual are proper. You have to make sure that your times are met, and you have to follow your form. Just as, for example, print journalism, there's a journalistic style of writing, and if you try to deviate from that, it's not going to work. But when you go past those conventions, then you're free to break out of those boundaries in terms of doing what people think they should be doing, to focus on what they really want to do. In your case, you're interviewing other people, which is perfect because that's the whole point. That's taking it beyond you. That's taking it to other people.
Interesting. Yeah. It's been a challenging road, but I think I'm finally finding my stride. More of Tools of the Trade in just a minute, but before we get back to the episode, I want to talk to you about our sponsor, CompanyCam. CompanyCam is your project photo organization solution, bar none, hands down, 100%. Every photo and video that your crews take at a job is now automatically organized by location and instantly synced from the field to wherever you are. Now you'll know exactly what's happening across your company, be able to communicate more effectively, and cover your butt from future claims. You can document your jobs, communicate with your crews, and protect your company all with CompanyCam, the only app that every contractor needs. This app has been battle tested by me. I use it on my jobs as a project manager. Many guests on this podcast have also used CompanyCam to organize their project photos, and it truly is your one-stop shop solution for organizing your company and your company photos. CompanyCam is also now totally free. Believe it or not, if you want to take advantage of their free account, which is 3 users and up to 50 projects, you can head over to companycam.com/tools. You can upgrade at any time. Sign up is quick, it's easy, and no credit card is required. So you can start right now. To discover which plan fits your needs and to get your company started, head over again to companycam.com/tools to get your photos organized and take back control of your project photo organization. So I wanted to know, in terms of your newspaper, there's just so many questions that are coming to mind here. Who's your ideal audience? Like, who's actually reading your publications?
That's an interesting question. The Ontario publication is a figment of legal law, and it's something that exists only in this market, only in Ontario, which set out a rule for the what I call Notice of Certificate of Substantial Performance, which is a legal document which basically turns the clock on for lien right execution in Ontario. Many other jurisdictions have lien laws and rules, and they have notice publication provisions, but none of them require the very specific wording in the law to say that this be published in a daily construction newspaper.
Right.
Historically, this resulted in a situation which was exceptional in business. There was a monopoly. Another publisher essentially published every day a newspaper in print format, and it charged whatever it wanted for those ads because you needed to publish them if you finished the job. There are a minimum of about 1,000 of these a month. Some months there would be 2,000 in the peak season. And if you have no competition and you have to buy the ad, well,
Charge whatever you want.
and you don't have to give any service either. You can treat the customers like dirt. I mean, no problem. I'm not saying they did, but they could.
Right.
The law was changed a couple of years last year to change the word of newspaper, the definition of it, to say print or electronic format. And that's where my eyes lit up, because for 25 years, I've been fielding calls from people calling my old newspapers saying, can I place one of these legal ads? And every time I'd have to say I decline because I'm publishing on a monthly cycle. I can't publish it. I can't accept those ads.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it would be irrational for someone to start a daily print newspaper, especially in the 2000s, because by the time you got any market share, you'd be broke. I mean, it'd be a very expensive proposition, but an electronic newspaper, maybe I could do that. And I thought, hey, what I could do is make it just like a regular print newspaper in PDF format with page turning and software, and that would comply with some other arcane laws in Ontario called the Legislation Act, which defines a newspaper. And I could charge half the price of the competitor and still make good money even on 10% of the volume. And so we started. And that's when I got in touch with Jim Lamzella of DataBid, who helped provide the data portion of the publication, got my staff together for the project. And May the 1st, 2019, after a slow start, it worked. Incidentally, the still competitor of ours, the daily newspaper, just this month suspended its print edition because the COVID plus the competition caused them to lose enough market that it became economic. And of course, they could see that we were publishing properly electronic version without any problems. So we now have competition on our level.
So now they're in the game, and This is actually a question from Jim himself because I told him that I was going to be talking to you today, and he wanted to know what you think the future is of these notices, of the notice publications, because obviously more people are catching wind of this. The market share is spreading out to be less of a monopoly online, and people may be lowering the rates to become more competitive. So, what's your future outlook on the notice publications?
It's hard to say. I mean, there could be a race to the bottom on pricing, in which case, at some point, it becomes an uneconomic to run a full-fledged, proper journalistic newspaper.
Right.
But the law's requirements are quite specific in terms of that it has to be a daily newspaper, and a daily newspaper has some definitions. So, how far you can go to just putting up a tiny website and reproduce a couple of press releases and call it a newspaper is hard to say. I guess I'll play it by ear. I mean, there's no debt in the business now, and I have a good team of people working with me, and we all know that nothing's forever. But on the other hand, the law was changed to make these things and still retain the daily newspaper provision. That was a major task to change the law. So I suspect we've got a good few years of publishing ahead of us.
Good. Jim, I hope that answers your question if you're listening, buddy.
Okay. Okay.
So, one of my questions in regards to that publication is what type of project needs to be published there? Is it a specific job size? Like, what are the parameters that require somebody to publish that notice of substantial?
Firstly, as far as I can tell, it is a civil work, not like roads and stuff like that. But if
Yeah,
there's a structure associated, for example, with infrastructure work, it might be needed to be like some sort of sewage treatment plant would need to be part of this, but the actual pipes that go into the ground might not be.
I
But
see.
it's a little confusing because I don't quite understand it why residential home builders don't need to put one of these in for every time they build a house. But we get these very small industrial or institutional renovation jobs, which look like there may be a 50 or $100,000 project, retrofits, and they pay us the order. It's definitely the general contractor that rather than the sub trades that are supposed to do this.
Yep,
Of course, sometimes subs act as generals when they take on let's say a mechanical, electrical job as a standalone project, and they will buy the ads. But it is a kind of confusing market. I've got to tell you, when I went into this, while I had a general idea of the provisions and the rules, I still was surprised by the character of the market and how it actually worked.
yeah. I think, like, what do you think? Do you think that residential homes should be in there? Because from my experience of owning a small residential electrical company, obviously I'm not a GC, so I may not fall into this category to begin with unless I'm self-performing, like you mentioned. But that's a big issue for us. Like when you're dealing with a homeowner and not a general contractor or a public project, liens come into play quite often, and there's a lot of legwork that goes into filing that, and it may be beneficial for these companies to be having that publication.
I wish I had the answer to it. I don't see anything in the law which says that why single family homes, for example, wouldn't be covered, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, condo buildings, large structures are covered by the law, but I just don't understand that. I sort of scratch my head a little bit. It's a good question. You're giving me a motivation to actually look up and say, maybe ask a lawyer what the reason why home builders do not generally purchase certificates of substantial performance and why they don't need to worry about their lien rights, because that would seem to be a factor when their subtrades and that are going to claim liens against them if they don't pay them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Could open up some more revenue. How else does a newspaper like yours stay afloat? So you've got this source of revenue here, but what other forms of revenue come in for typical publications? Is it mainly just ads?
Yeah, well, our revenue is primarily advertising. Some other publications do sell their data as a part of the service, but in this case, we're buying the data from DataBid. So
Right.
that doesn't apply to us. The other type of sales we will get will be advertising of conventional display ads that will go in with the news section of the publication and feature profiles. In other words, where people want to buy editorialized writing to create that impression that they want for their marketing purposes as opposed to a conventional ad, in which case I or my staff writer will actually write the story in journalistic form. We don't misrepresent it as news coverage. We specify that it's paid for, but it looks and has a feel of a news story. And that is a good supplementary source of revenue for us.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many little nuances. You think that, oh, I'm maybe I'll just start a publication or a newspaper or some sort of blog that does the same thing you do. But there's so much tied into it from the legislation side and all of these little nuances that you have to keep going. And it's a lot of work. So like you mentioned, for competition, it would be tough to keep up with that. It seems like a lot of work to put into to maintain.
Obviously, if you have expertise in the field, you can probably do things. Yeah, I could enter into this business because I've been publishing publications in the construction sector, and especially in this province, for 3 decades. And in fact, it was very clear of what the issue was and where the market was. And of course, it's nice to have a monopoly. I'm sure that the former monopoly publisher enjoyed their period of time when they could make huge profits without having to fight, even think about fighting for customers, because, well, you don't need to market. Just think about it. You have to buy the ads to protect your lean lights,
Yeah.
and you can only do it in one place.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And it's very rare that a private sector business has that type of power. And now the world is, obviously, we got a more conventional market where we have to compete. But I guess we were effectively first in as a competitor, and that gives us an advantage because we learned how to treat everyone properly, deliver the service that people want, and we're viable, which is fun.
So you've been involved in writing about construction for so long, and obviously it's not your direct background. You don't come from construction, you're not from the trades, and you've probably, if you've been in it for this long, you've learned to appreciate some aspects of it. So I was wondering if you could talk to me about what you like most about construction, or maybe what type of stories you like publishing most, or capturing.
Outside the human interest stuff, I like the stories where I touch on controversies or challenges and reflecting the industry's perspective rather than the outsiders. Recently, we had an interesting tussle between the General Contractors Association of Ontario, or Ontario General Contractors Association, a major Ontario university. And they basically said there's a problem with this university is starting to play around with its contractors and is suggesting that COVID-19 is not a grounds for force majeure or delay claims.
Yeah.
Apparently, the contract was initially, in the case that came to my attention, the contract was initially negotiated before the pandemic hit, but they hadn't executed it yet. So there was a work stoppage, of course. And then the university came back with amended contract language, is basically saying we're exempting for COVID-19 for force majeure, and you're responsible for delays. And the contractor went to the association and complained about it. And the association did what associations are supposed to do. It went to the press, mainly me,
Yeah.
because I could cover the story without direct harm to my business. Obviously, we don't name the contractor. Normally, you don't like to work with anonymous sources, but the association has a reputable name, and I don't have any reason to doubt their accuracy. So we took the issue up. The university ultimately changed the wording and reverted to a more conventional contract language, so the contractor was able to take the job without fear. I don't think the university likes me very much, though.
No
I
kidding.
did get a very snappy email from their communications department, which we published, basically saying we're unethical and we're unfair. But the funny thing is they sent that email to me and they copied it to the association.
Really?
And so the association guys responded to that email saying, no, you're not unethical and you did a great job. So I quoted them in this story too. Now, to me, that is a fun role of journalism because they're serving a public good. We're covering an important issue. We're taking on a controversial thing. It's part of the core of the industry, the viability of the business to make it, the contract language to be good. And it's satisfying to do the job that we're supposed to do in journalism. That is, bring things to the surface that need to be discussed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I really enjoy that stuff.
Now that segues right into questions that I love to ask on this podcast, because I like to consider myself progressive, and that comes in multiple forms with the content that I publish, including getting more young people and women into the trades and all sorts of other things. But one of the things I like to ask people, and you just mentioned this, telling the story from the industry side, what do you think the construction industry needs to do better at? Or you can take that however you want, but what do you think could improve about our industry from what you've seen so far?
I think that there's two things that can happen. Firstly, the industry can become more businesslike and more aware of it, especially the people owning the businesses can think about how they need to run their businesses to be more savvy, if you want to call it that. Although that said, I think most people in this industry, especially those who do any well and survive, have incredible street smarts and great intelligence, and it's not the amount of years of university you go to get that skill.
Right.
It's very much hands-on. I spent a lot of time, or a fair bit of time, with the Home Builders Association, particularly a committee that's dedicated to the issue of encouraging young people to take up careers in construction. And the interesting thing there is, while all this effort to market this in cooperation with school districts and all that, there's a common denominator explaining the problem:
What's that? Tell me. I'm dying to know.
the parents.
Yes.
Parents do not like the idea. And this is a story. A young kid in high school gets a co-op placement, encouraged to sign up, and he goes home to tell his mom and dad, hey, I've got this great opportunity. And they say, you're not doing that. Whether it's because of preconceived assumptions about what the work is, that it's unstable, it's risky, it's dangerous, or there's just beneath the dignity of the parents put their hands down and say no. And so all your marketing gets blown out of the water. In other words, you do all the recruiting and all the efforts to get a young person interested in the career. And so you have the complexity here. So you've got the young people who are sons and daughters of people in the industry.
Yeah.
And of course, some of them are happy, and those are the natural ones who take on to the career. Then they're the ones who maybe feel their lives are dead-end jobs. They're not happy with their work, and they express that to their kids. You can't do this when you grow up. Don't do it, right? So that shuts that group out of the market.
Right.
And then you got all the others who are not in construction, who have the stereotypes and assumptions about the industry. And how do you get them to change? And this is a question I don't have the answer to. If your target is to get young people to take careers in construction, how do you get their parents to change their mind?
You know what? I had this conversation with another strategic partner of mine a couple weeks ago, and we were kind of looking at it like this. Parents put a lot of money aside for their children's education, and most people think of traditional investments as real estate or stocks. But if you look at investment in your child's education and the amount of opportunity that there is in the trades and construction, the cost for education being almost nil after you go through all of the government grants that are available, and then that person gets right into a job, they're earning money, and they have no student loans. To me, I think that that is just as good an investment as buying real estate or investing in the stock market. And I think if we can get parents on board to see their children's future as an investment, and the fact that this industry is just crying for people, and it may be cyclical, it may have a bad rap in being blue collar, but there's people like yourself here that have found passion in construction through journalism. I've talked to multiple people that have stumbled into a path of construction on the business development side, on the project management side. I talked to a guy that was developing products for an HIV company as a pharmaceutical scientist, and then he transitioned to project management. And there's just so much opportunity above and beyond the traditional get your hands dirty, which there's nothing wrong with. That's where I came from, as an electrician. And I think that parents just need to see it that way. And it's going to be tough nut to crack, but we got to figure that out at some point and start directing our marketing efforts in that way.
I agree. Yes, there is difficult conditions at times in construction. I mean, the guys who have to go into the underground sewer environments and other places like that, they're dirty jobs in this industry. But the technology is evolving, the challenges and the opportunities are just incredible. And I agree with you. There's not too many places where you can finish high school and start your apprenticeship and start making money better than most people who finish a 4-year degree in university, and you're perfectly good health and safety conditions in the current environment.
Absolutely.
I would not be the right person to do that type of work. I would probably damage myself if I tried to do real trades work. But the point is, as I did find my career, it was through a sort of apprenticeship program. I found my jobs and my opportunities to learn my craft. And construction it's built into it.
Yeah. You know what? I think, Mark, the place that I'd like to end this podcast with is you yourself. You went out there, you found who you were, you took opportunity, you went to Africa, you started your own business. And the way I look at it, like, you are a very successful guy, and you've really taken life by the horns and decided that you were going to create the path for yourself. So with the Toolbox talks here, it's geared towards the entire industry, but it has a focus on apprenticeship. And I wanted to hear from you if you had any advice for any young people that are starting an apprenticeship of any kind and are trying to find their way through their career and are looking for opportunity, if you could lend them any advice based on your experience.
Some people have the fortune when they are very young to know what in themselves who they are. And if you're in one of those, that fortunate category, which I guess I was, because I think when I was 10 years old, I started a newspaper around my home, like a mimeograph thing or something like that. And so I guess I was made for what I was doing. And I think that does happen for some apprentices and people who choose the trades. And those are the really fortunate ones because they have a path which is clear and simple, and they can follow it and they will have their happiness because it's baked in. For the other people, it's a more complex issue because how do you determine what you do? We talked earlier in this conversation about authentic, right? If you do things because people tell you to do something or not to tell you, if your parents say this is what you should do, or your friends are saying this is what you should do, and it's not within you to do those things, then you're going to find yourself ultimately later in life not happy, unless you have some good luck and it just turns out numbers all come up right.
Yeah.
But how do you help people find that magic passion when they don't know what it is? I don't know, because I didn't have that problem, and I suspect you didn't have that problem either.
Yeah.
There is one bit of advice I did pick up is, what are the times and things that you've done in your life that you've really enjoyed and that you're good at? It doesn't matter whether it's work or anything else. It can be a social activity, it can be something like that, because that's probably the clue as to what you should be doing. And then it's just a matter of figuring out how to match that with a economic activity that would work for you.
That's good advice. Yeah. And I think just to put you in the spotlight one more time here, you've definitely showcased that if you want something, regardless of whether you're passionate for it or not, whether it's the path that the higher power or whoever you believe in is laid out for you, the only opportunity you're going to get in life, I believe, is by just going out and getting after it. Like you went out and even though you knew it was what you wanted to do and you were passionate and you had the talent for it, you still went out, paid that plane ticket to Africa, went and experienced the war, did all sorts of crazy things in a bar, and you lived your life and you really pushed the limits and you tried real estate and you tried everything. So I hope that people can see that it's not a linear path. You have to try multiple things and just take it from you. You've tried multiple things, you found what stuck, and now you're happy as a clam and you love what you do, and it comes out thoroughly in the way you talk about your industry and our industry, construction. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I really appreciate this chance to speak with you, and also the experience of being on the other end of the interviewing process. And yes, I think you probably do have the right stuff for a journalistic career if you want that.
Who knows? Who knows? Maybe we'll talk offline.
Okay.
Mark, is there anything I left off the table in regards to the news, construction, or anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention before we get to wrapping up?
Outside of just if you want to get a taste of what my business is about, you could visit ontarioconstructionnews.com. There are a bunch of other regional titles, and we don't force them into a corporate structure that you go to a central place to see these things, because realistically, the people in New York, construction industry, or Florida don't really care what happens in Ontario. So we don't push people from one of those medias to another. But if you look at one of the major states in the US and type in the name of the state in construction, you may well find one of my products.
Sounds good. And for anybody listening, as I always do with all of my guests, this information will be available at toolspodcast.com, where you can check out links to things that we've mentioned. You can get a bit more of Mark's story, all the links that he mentioned to his publications, as well as areas where you can get in contact with him, will be available there. And Mark, I really enjoyed having you on the podcast, and thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
That's a wrap. That's a wrap, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. For show notes, blog posts, resources, and access to our newsletter, check out toolspodcast.com.